Okay, hi again. Welcome to Living Well with Gastroparesis for Loved Ones. I am Crystal Soltrelli. For those of you who don't know me, I am a certified health counselor and a gastroparesis educator. I am the author of Living Well with Gastroparesis, and I have gastroparesis myself. I was diagnosed with idiopathic gastroparesis in 2004, so I have quite a bit of personal experience, and I have worked with hundreds at this point of GPers around the world. Also some loved ones. I've worked with parents mostly, some spouses or partners. So I've noticed over the years that there is, it doesn't just affect the people who have gastroparesis, right? It affects everyone around them, their family, their partners, their spouses, their close friends, parents, children. But there really isn't a lot out there for loved ones, the people with gastroparesis, and that's sort of what spurred this class. I'm hoping tonight to kind of bridge the gap, because I think sometimes it's difficult for those who don't have GP to understand exactly what it's like to live with GP and some of the challenges that you see your loved one going through. And I think on the flip side, it's difficult for the people who have GPs to kind of step back a minute and look at it from the perspective of their loved ones who are really trying to do the best they can and doing the best to understand and support them. And sometimes we just have a little disconnect in terms of what's the best way to offer support and receive support. So tonight we're going to talk a lot about that, and hopefully this will be helpful for everyone involved and help everyone live well with gastroparesis, because my work is really centered around learning to live well with the condition, and that doesn't just apply to the person with the condition. It applies to all of you listening tonight as well. So with that brief introduction, let's get started. So in this class, we are going to first talk about the basics of gastroparesis, which might be a review for some of you. But I want to make sure we're all on the same page, and we all know exactly what we're talking about when we say gastroparesis or GP. I'll refer to it tonight as GP. I will refer to people who have gastroparesis as GPers. It's just easier to say sometimes. We'll talk about some common misconceptions. There are a lot of them, both among people who have GP and their loved ones, but we'll dispel some of those misconceptions. I want to talk about the comprehensive gastroparesis management plan a little bit so that you really understand what it is that your loved ones can do to best manage this condition, because that really plays a lot into their actions, into their priorities, into their behaviors and in their limitations, and things that you will see from them as they go through the process of implementing a comprehensive gastroparesis management plan. So I want to talk a little bit about exactly what that means and why it's important, because I think all of us need to understand that in order to support it. I don't know why we're out of order, but let me click through here. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about how it really feels to have gastroparesis, because I think what I did here is actually I went on Facebook and asked some of my followers to tell me how they describe having gastroparesis, how it feels physically and mentally. And I wrote down their words for you from a bunch of different people. So I think sometimes when we're only hearing it from one person, and maybe when it's presented in kind of a very close to home way, right? Very emotional, very raw, very personal, it might get a little lost. And so this way, I want to show you how the continuity, first of all, among the experience of gastroparesis, and also the differences. Because what you read online or what you hear from a doctor or what you hear from another patient may not be exactly the way your loved one is experiencing it. So I've got some descriptions for you in GPers' own words to help maybe help you understand a little bit more about what it's like. We will talk about how all of you can live well with gastroparesis, GPers and loved ones alike, and what that involves, and talk about some troubleshooting, challenges that come up, and how we can maybe best address them. Then we'll talk about ways to support someone with gastroparesis, and there are a lot of different ways, and not all of them will be right for every family or couple or GP or loved one, but we'll go through a number of them. And lastly, as I said, I will take your questions, as many as I can, right at the end of the class. So let's get started. I want to talk about gastroparesis and what it is. So GP is a functional gastrointestinal motility disorder. That's a mouthful. And the important things to know are functional. That means it's an issue with the way the stomach functions. There's nothing wrong with the stomach structurally. There's no obstruction. There's nothing that anyone could see. If you were to just look at the stomach, if you could go in with the doctor and look at the inside of the stomach, you wouldn't be able to see anything different. It's in the way the stomach functions. The motility part is movement, right? So it's the functional issue is with the way the stomach empties, with the way the stomach moves food into the small intestine. Now, this is specific to the stomach. I think that's sometimes a misconception that it applies to the whole GI tract or that it's the intestines. Certainly, interestingly, a lot of medical professionals, they think they know what gastroparesis is, but once you get talking to them, they seem to think it's an intestinal issue. It's specific to the stomach. If you kind of break down the word gastro, stomach, paresis, some people say paralysis, it's really just kind of slow, right? Slow movement. So it's a slow stomach. Certainly, people with gastroparesis can have motility problems in other parts of the GI tract, but the diagnosis of gastroparesis itself is specific to the stomach. It's experienced differently from person to person, okay? So we're going to talk about that in a minute in the misconceptions. Not everybody who has gastroparesis has the same set of symptoms. It varies quite a bit, and it can vary based on cause, based on severity, or simply, just person to person. And the symptoms tend to ebb and flow. So if you spend a lot of time with someone with gastroparesis, if you live with them especially, some days will be better than others. And it's hard to predict those ebbs and flows in symptoms, but one day they might be able to eat something or do something that they can't do the next day. And, it's not that they're making it up or that they're more sensitive one day than the other. The symptoms really do just tend to ebb and flow, and that can change with a lot of different things. It can be dependent on hormones for women, so it can ebb and flow with menstrual cycles, certainly with stress. We're going to talk a little bit about stress and gastroparesis, but stress does not cause gastroparesis, but it is definitely a factor. And so as stress ebbs and flows, so may symptoms, and sometimes it's for seemingly no reason. It's not that they did anything wrong, or it just some days are better than others. Some days the stomach empties more quickly than others. Gastroparesis is typically diagnosed via a 4-hour gastric emptying scan. And I say this because if your loved one has not had a 4-hour gastric emptying scan, it might be a good thing to talk about or look into. Some doctors who aren't terribly familiar with motility disorders like gastroparesis may diagnose it via an endoscopy. Certainly, you can see if you might see food in the stomach on endoscopy, and that might indicate gastroparesis. But lack of food in the stomach on endoscopy does not rule out gastroparesis, and it's really not a good diagnostic tool. Likewise, the 60-minute, 90-minute, and 2-hour gastric emptying scans are not nearly as accurate as the 4-hour gastric emptying scans for diagnosing GP, so they can miss a lot of diagnoses. So that's really the gold standard is the 4-hour emptying scan. And lastly, unfortunately, gastroparesis is poorly understood by the general medical community. So most doctors have heard of it. They are familiar with what it means, but they don't know a lot about it, and they don't know a lot about treating it. And so the information that you receive may or may not be accurate, It may or may not be current because a lot of things have changed in terms of motility disorders and neurogastroenterology, which is the science of the nerves within the GI tract, which tend to be affected with gastroparesis. And so sometimes you have to go from doctor to doctor and get multiple opinions. And what's really important here is that your loved one and you, okay, if you're supporting someone with gastroparesis, really be their advocate and make sure that they're getting the attention and the treatment that they need and deserve, and not just kind of brush it off if a doctor brushes it off, because doctors don't always know the ins and outs of gastroparesis, especially if you're seeing a general practitioner, even a general gastroenterologist. Okay, so that's the basics of gastroparesis. All right. Common misconceptions, and there are many. And there are many among people with gastroparesis, and there are many among the medical profession, and there are many among loved ones. So we're going to cover a wide range here. I think part of this comes from the internet. The internet is one of the scariest places for people with gastroparesis or people who love people with gastroparesis. There are tons of horror stories and worst case scenarios and some just plain old inaccurate information out there, unfortunately. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of us are kind of left to because the medical community is so poorly informed. So we're kind of left to our own devices, and we turn to the internet and we might not get the best information. So let's dispel some of these misconceptions. The first being that gastroparesis is a rare condition, and it makes sense that we would think this because most of us, before we were diagnosed or before we had a loved one who was diagnosed, had never heard of it, right? So, and you probably don't know very many other people with it. It seems like it would be rare. In actuality, the numbers are kind of hazy. There's not a lot of good statistics, but it's thought to affect about 1.5 million people in the United States alone. So that's a lot of people. It's on par with celiac disease, which is much more well known, and things like irritable bowel disorder. I'm sorry, IBD. I'm having a inflammatory bowel disorder. There we go. Crohn's disease, colitis, things like that. So it's not as rare as we might think. The second thing is that it's most often seen in diabetics, and this is still a misconception, I think, among many medical professionals. I know personally whenever I go to, if I'm in the ER or I see a new general doctor, the first thing they ask when they say I have gastroparesis is if I'm diabetic. In actuality, the most common classification of the disorder is called idiopathic, which basically just means they don't know. They don't know what caused it. It's idiopathic. But diabetes is the most common known cause, okay? So about 36 or so % of cases are idiopathic, about 30-ish are diabetic. The rest are either caused by surgery or a virus or secondary disorders, things like mitochondrial disease or scleroderma. But if you encounter people who insist that your loved one must be diabetic if they have gastroparesis, I assure you that is not true. Next is that it's easily managed with medication or dietary changes. This is really important, and it's something we're going to touch on several times throughout the next hour. Gastroparesis is actually usually not well managed via medication alone or even via dietary changes alone. It's best managed with what I call a comprehensive management plan, and we're going to go over exactly what that means. But the medication that's available for gastroparesis is not very effective in I would say at least half of cases. Okay, there's not a ton of really good information about who it works for and who it doesn't, and it works to varying degrees. Some people have very good success with the medication, but for most people it works in conjunction with these other things, or it may not work at all. So if your loved one is given a prescription, that does not mean that they just have to take the pill and they will be all better. Unfortunately, that's not the case with this condition. And also with dietary changes, it's not just a matter of, eat less fat or eat less fiber, which you've probably heard if you've spent some time around someone with gastroparesis. There's a lot more to it, and we're going to talk about that. But it's sometimes made out to be just a stomach ache or just some indigestion, and just change the way you eat or take this pill. And it is, in the vast majority of cases, not at all that simple. The next is that gastroparesis is caused by stress and or it's all in your head. This is something I think that's especially emotionally charged and frustrating for a lot of people with gastroparesis. It is not caused by stress, and it's certainly not, a mental disorder, or it's not made up. Functional disorders are difficult because you can't see what's wrong, and that presents a difficult problem for the medical profession and for, a lot of other people. But stress does exacerbate gastroparesis symptoms. The brain and the gut are very, very intimately connected, and there are pathways that go from the brain to the gut and from the gut to the brain. So the signals go both ways, and stress in the head can cause gut symptoms, and stress in the gut can cause, stress in the head. So it's kind of a cycle, and it's a difficult cycle, and stress management becomes a very, very important part of gastroparesis management. And that's a place where loved ones can really play a role and can really help out. But it's just important to know it's not caused by stress, but stress is a factor. Okay, next is that vomiting is the main symptom, and that's actually not true. Nausea is more common than vomiting. Fullness is more common. Certainly many, many people with gastroparesis do vomit, but if you do not vomit, it does not mean you have gastroparesis. Symptoms include nausea, fullness, vomiting, pain, reflux, regurgitation, bloating, and anybody can have any combination of those symptoms. So it doesn't look the same for everybody. It doesn't present the same for everybody. But there are a myriad of symptoms that your loved one may experience. And just because they don't necessarily have what's thought to be common or the most common, doesn't mean that they're not truly experiencing that. The next is that gastroparesis does not cause pain. And if you go to a doctor's appointment with someone who has gastroparesis, you might actually hear the doctor say this. It's one of those older beliefs about gastroparesis that if you talk with a motility specialist, someone who specializes in these kinds of disorders, they will now dispel. They now know that pain is a common symptom among people with gastroparesis. The reason for it is not well known. There may be some what's called visceral hypersensitivity. And basically what that means is that in someone who has gastroparesis, their nerves in their gut are much more sensitive than yours. And so something that might not really cause you any discomfort can cause them extreme pain. And, that's not necessarily the case with everybody, but that's thought to be the case with some people. And so pain and quite severe pain can be a symptom of gastroparesis. The next is that it causes only stomach symptoms, right? So only these things like nausea, vomiting, etc. It can also cause fatigue. Fatigue is very, very common. Again, the why is not necessarily known. My own personal opinion, I don't really have any science to back this up, but it's just my opinion, is that digestion requires a lot of energy, and that is true. We know that it requires a lot of energy for your body to digest and absorb your food. For you and people without gastroparesis, the stomach, you eat, your stomach does its job and it digests and it gets a break between your meal and your next meal, okay? And in the meantime, it can do whatever else it needs to do. For people with gastroparesis, your body is constantly digesting. Because the stomach is so slow, most people will not fully empty a meal before they start another meal. Some people won't even empty a meal overnight. So the stomach is constantly digesting. The body is constantly working on that digestive process. And so that kind of physically zaps energy. It's also emotionally draining to live every day with a chronic illness. And that's just, it's not a woe is me thing. It's just the truth, especially in the beginning when you're trying to figure out what to do. It's a lot to deal with. So there are physical and emotional fatigue here, but it's common. There can also be things like depression and anxiety, and those are very real symptoms. Again, it's not in the head, and it doesn't mean that if someone has depression or anxiety, they're making up the gastroparesis or causing the gastroparesis. As I said, the brain and the gut are very intimately connected, and the messages go both ways. And some of the neurotransmitters that are, that play a role in the brain, so feel-good hormones like serotonin, are made in the gut primarily. Most of your serotonin is made in your gut. If you have gut dysfunction, you can have brain chemical, differences. And so it's really it's more than just stomach symptoms sometimes. But again, not in the head. That's not what I mean. Okay, symptoms are consistent from day to day. I already went over this, I think, a little bit. They can vary, from day to day, from week to week. Usually they don't typically resolve completely. There's another condition called cyclic vomiting syndrome, that's CVS, that is periods of extreme vomiting followed by periods of almost complete remission. But for something like gastroparesis, it doesn't usually resolve completely in between. You have flare-ups, really. So you have kind of your baseline symptoms, and then they might get worse at times, like I said, around the menstrual cycle or around stress. But, they kind of ebb and flow, but don't usually go away completely. Another misconception is that people with GP look sick, or if you don't look sick, you don't feel sick. I think this is one that, again, is kind of emotionally charged and frustrating for people with gastroparesis. But many people with gastroparesis look very, very healthy, even when they, feel very, very bad and they are maybe very symptomatic. So you can't judge a book by its cover. That's a very accurate thing to say about gastroparesis. Some people think that it's an eating disorder, or that they think that, when someone with gastroparesis chooses not to eat, that it's akin to an eating disorder. It is not. Now, I will say that in my experience working with people, food-related anxiety becomes very common because eating does cause symptoms for many people, because symptoms can be unpredictable, because it can be difficult to figure out what will and will not make you feel sick. It is fairly common to develop anxiety around food, especially new foods. That is something that I say in the self-guided program that I have and in my book really needs to be addressed. That's something that's up to the GP to address, but if that's an issue, they need to do so, because that limits nutrition and it limits their ability to really live well with gastroparesis. But gastroparesis itself is not an eating disorder. You can't just force yourself to eat, okay, in many cases. You will just get sick. That would be like if you had a stomach virus or food poisoning and someone just kept telling you to just keep eating anyway. It doesn't work. So it's not an eating disorder, but if there is an element of food-related anxiety, that does need to be addressed. Gastroparesis does not mean that you can't eat solid food or that you shouldn't eat solid food. Most people with gastroparesis can and do eat solid food. Liquids can be helpful during flare-ups. They can be helpful supplementally for nutrition. You can alternate solid and liquid meals, but it doesn't mean you can never eat again. Gastroparesis does not always lead to weight loss, and people with gastroparesis are not always thin. Gastroparesis for some people actually leads to weight gain, and a lot of it has to do with, metabolism and history of dieting. So people who have been chronic dieters or yo-yo dieters, Sometimes we'll actually gain weight with gastroparesis because you know, the metabolism's already kind of screwed up from years of dieting. And depending on the diet that they go to, like what kind of gastroparesis-friendly diet they go to, right? If it's all carbohydrates, if it's all white processed food, which is sadly recommended by a lot of doctors and nutritionists, that can lead to weight gain even if they're eating very few calories. So, you know, if someone is maintaining their weight or gaining weight and they say that they're only eating, you know, these small amounts of food, they very well could be telling the truth. There's a lot more that goes into weight than calories in, calories out, despite what the diet industry would have us believe. So it's important to know that you know, weight does not reflect the severity of gastroparesis. It does not reflect the severity of symptoms. Okay, gastroparesis does not always progress over time. It's not necessarily a progressive condition. So gastroparesis itself, and I've asked various motility doctors and experts about this, having gastroparesis itself does not necessarily mean that it's going to get worse. It doesn't mean that you'll end up on a feeding tube, for instance. I think a lot of people are very worried about that, and that's actually something that I should have put in here because I think when you go on the internet especially, that's one of the first things that you as a loved one may worry about, that your loved one with GP might end up on a feeding tube. It's the small minority of people. We're talking about 10%, 10 to 15% who need artificial nutrition. But in terms of its progression over time, it really depends on the cause. And so if there's an underlying condition that's going to progress, something, you know, some other kind of thing like Parkinson's disease or some primary disorder, and that will progress, then the GP may progress over time. Personally, I think a lot of it has to do with nutrition, and that's just what I've seen in my work with gastroparesis. You know, the body needs nourishment in order to function and in order to heal, so that's why that's important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there are a lot of factors that go into how someone experiences it and the outcome of GP over time, but it's not necessarily progressive. And lastly, that it never goes away. So you may hear there's no cure for gastroparesis, and I like to say there's no medical cure for gastroparesis. You know, there's no magic pill. There's nothing that anybody can do to take it away right now, but it does go away for some people. And again, it depends on the cause. It depends on whether or not there's an underlying condition. It depends, I think it depends on, you know, the ways in which it's managed and things like nutrition and stress management and those kinds of things, because they can all affect the GI tract and the way the GI tract functions and heals. So, you know, to say it never goes away is inaccurate because I've worked with many people who have gotten better, not necessarily from my work, but just from nature taking its course. Post-viral gastroparesis is kind of the best case scenario, quote unquote, in that it typically resolves on its own within, you know, 1 to 3 years usually, but certainly idiopathic cases, you know, can resolve, and it can be managed. And I think that's the important thing to know is that in the meantime, right, so there's the possibility that it could go away on its own at some point, but in the meantime, there are things that we can do to manage the symptoms and, more importantly, or just as importantly, improve quality of life. So briefly, how is gastroparesis treated? Usually, okay, typically, and when you're diagnosed, you are diagnosed by a doctor who is an expert in practicing medicine. And he knows about medicine primarily, and so he will prescribe medicine. Usually they will also mention, hopefully, dietary changes, but it's sometimes just a mention. So the medications are usually some combination or trial of Reglan, erythromycin, and or domperidone. Those are the only 3 medicines that are really specifically indicated for the treatment of gastroparesis, at least in this country, and domperidone actually isn't FDA approved. So it's really in this country Reglan and erythromycin, though many people do use domperidone. And then you'll often hear GPers will be told low fat, low fiber, 3-step diet. That's kind of the traditional handout. One, everyone gets a handout. Or hopefully they at least get a handout. Some people get nothing. And the emphasis is really on calories and not nutrition. So that's kind of the usual, the way it usually goes when you're diagnosed. That's what you're given. Now, what I've seen through my work and personally, what's most effective is a comprehensive management plan. And so what that means is a combination of things. It's dietary modification, so it's lower fat, lower fiber, small, well-balanced, nutrient-rich meals with an emphasis on proper nutrition, because that's really important right from the get-go to help the body function and heal. There might also be nutritional supplementation through different drinks like Orgain or supplements, vitamins. So that's one part of it. Now this might require some time, some investment. I just did a class 2 weeks ago on juicing and blending, which is a great way to get more nutrition in a gastroparesis-friendly diet. But there are changes that come with eating for gastroparesis versus how people were eating before they had gastroparesis. So this is a lot of trial and error, which we will also talk about in a little bit. But it's important to know that this is an important aspect of managing gastroparesis, but none of these things alone usually provide adequate relief. So if your loved one is just trying to manage this via their diet, or just trying to manage this via medicine, or even a combination of the two, you might want to encourage them to look more at the comprehensive management plan, because this is where they're really going to get the most relief and improvement in quality of life. So dietary modification is definitely one part of it, with an emphasis on proper nutrition. The next is lifestyle practices, and this includes things like regular physical activity, adequate sleep and rest. These are really important. I mean, sometimes these seem like luxuries, but they're not when it comes to managing gastroparesis. These are imperative. It's also necessary to re-examine priorities, and this is true for both the GPer and you, for their loved ones, because you only have so much, so many resources. There are only so many hours in a day. There's only so much time. There's only so much money. And the priorities in terms of how you invest those resources as a couple or a family becomes really important. And you have to think about changes that everyone might have to make in order to facilitate this kind of comprehensive management plan, so that there is time for activity, so that there is time for rest, so that we can better manage stress. It's also about respecting limitations, and this is really important, and this is something where this is an area where you can really help the person with gastroparesis, because when you have gastroparesis, your limitations change, right? You can't eat whatever you want. You have limitations when it comes to your diet, also when it comes to your energy, okay? So like I said, fatigue is very, very common among gastroparesis. And the harder someone pushes themselves past their limit, the worse time they're going to have with symptoms, the longer it'll take them to recover. And so encouraging someone to respect their limitations and not pushing them to go past their limitations, whether that means encouraging them to try foods that they said they can't try, or that they know they can't try, or to do things that really exhaust them. This is really an area where you can be of assistance. Appropriate medical treatment is definitely part of a comprehensive gastroparesis management plan. That might include medication that we talked about. It might include procedures, things like Botox injections, the gastric nerve stimulator. It might, for some people, like I said, a minority, but still a good number of people, it includes nutritional support via different types of feeding tubes. And so it's important that they do have the medical treatment and the attention from qualified medical practitioners that they need and that they deserve. And so this might require, like I said, going to a bunch of doctors, unfortunately. I mean, I can't even count how many doctors I've seen in the last 8 years, but, really being their advocate and helping them to be their own advocate becomes very important. Stress management. Like I said, this is huge, and this is something that obviously stress management, it's big for everybody. Stress in this country is just ridiculous, but when it comes to gastroparesis, again, it's not a luxury. It's not a thing that, maybe I'll work on that when I have time. This is vital to managing gastroparesis, and it's difficult because it's stressful to have gastroparesis, and it's stressful on you, the loved one, right? If you're a parent or a spouse or a partner or a child of someone with gastroparesis, it's stressful. You're worried about them. You're worried about their health. You're dealing with changes in your own life, right, from all of this. And certainly it's stressful for you. It's stressful for them. The stress just compounds on itself, and so stress management becomes really important for everybody, okay? And that means that implementing a daily relaxation practice, which we'll talk about how you can support them. You might want to be a part of their daily relaxation practice, both as support and also to help you kind of deal with all of this. It means distressing the home, okay? So thinking about ways that you can maybe alleviate some of the things that are stressing them out, helping them identify those ways and implementing those ways, practicing better self-care, giving them the space and the okay to do that. It also might mean distressing the workplace, and this is something that comes up and becomes an issue in a lot of families. Working with gastroparesis, especially working full-time, especially in a high-stress or high-demand or rigid job, can become difficult for many people. And so you might have to reevaluate whether that means the person has to go part-time, whether it means they have to take a less stressful position. But it is important to realize that plays a role because they're there several hours a day. And so the stress that they're encountering at work can certainly be playing a role in their ability to manage their gastroparesis symptoms. And that's in many cases, a family decision and a family concern. So that's something that has to be talked about and addressed. Complementary therapies, things like acupuncture, massage therapy, it might include things like biofeedback or hypnotherapy. There are a number of complementary therapies that are very effective for symptom management for gastroparesis, things like nausea, vomiting, pain, and again, this comes under priorities, right? Because these things cost money. Sometimes they're not approved by insurance. They take time, and so these are things that you have to think about with your loved one and talk about and plan for and budget and decide what you can do and what you can't do. But just know that these can often be a really important part of a comprehensive management plan. And lastly, coping skills. And this is something that you kind of can help with, but not really, because this is really up to the person. We'll talk a little bit about acceptance in a little bit. It's about attitude, but it is also about support and having the support from you, their loved ones, and also sometimes professional support. But how someone views this, how someone is able to cope with this, the skills that they have to cope with this can make a big difference. So all of this together is a comprehensive gastroparesis management plan. And when people are practicing every aspect of this management plan, that's when things really come together. That's when their symptoms really kind of are better managed. That's when quality of life improves. And it's important for you to know this because if you look at this, it kind of looks like a full-time job. This is a lot of work. It's a lot of work for someone with gastroparesis to manage their symptoms in a comprehensive way to the best of their ability. And so, when you think about what can I do to help, how can I support, think about all of this, all of the things that they're dealing with, all the things that they're thinking about, all of the things that they have to consider on a daily basis in order to make this happen. I think it's really important to know that each of these pieces plays a role. And so when you think about as a family your priorities, when you think about your time management as a family, when you think about your finances as a family, all of this should hopefully come into play. Okay, now I want to just briefly talk a little bit about from the standpoint of people with gastroparesis. like I said, I asked people on my Facebook page to tell me how it felt for them physically to have gastroparesis, to help other people maybe understand. And this is important for you to see, it varies from person to person, but there's also continuity. And if you recognize some phrases, if you recognize some descriptions, your loved one is not alone. So things like, I feel like I ate Thanksgiving dinner even when I only ate a few bites. So that kind of fullness, that very, very uncomfortable fullness, indigestion, you know how you feel after you've eaten Thanksgiving dinner, or especially after you've eaten like your second Thanksgiving dinner, when you've had leftovers afterwards and you really feel lousy. That's how it often feels with gastroparesis. It feels like you ate way too much food that then didn't agree with you, right? So maybe you went out to a restaurant, you ordered a big, big meal, and then that meal made you really sick, right? So it can feel like that. Somebody said that it felt like they were swimming in caramel, okay? So just really slow, like everything was just dragging, really slow, really tired. For a lot of people, it feels like they're pregnant, okay, even if they're not expecting. Now, I actually am 6 months pregnant right now, so I know what it really feels like. And I know from before I was pregnant, when I had gastroparesis, it's a pretty accurate comparison. You can get extreme bloating, and it's so uncomfortable. It can be embarrassing. It really affects, self-esteem and self-image to look and feel like you're 6 months pregnant when you're really not expecting. Someone else said it feels like morning sickness all day, every day. Someone said it feels like they've eaten plastic or a shoe or something else that's inedible. Like it just sits there in the stomach. Your stomach can't digest it. It's just really uncomfortable feeling. Several people said that, on bad days they feel like they have a stomach virus. So if you've ever had a stomach flu, you know that feeling. And good days feel like you're recovering from a stomach virus. So you know that feeling, the day after the virus, when you're feeling a little bit better, but you're feeling the after effects, right? You're tired, you're weak, you just don't feel that great. So these are some ways that real people with gastroparesis have explained what it feels like, and you probably recognize or have heard some of those phrases. I want to go back. Okay. So what's it like to have gastroparesis from a mental perspective? And this is another part of it because, gastroparesis is difficult physically, but it can be equally difficult mentally. And so I wanted to ask this, and I wanted to put this out there for all of you to realize that it's not just a stomach ache, it's not just a physical thing, that there are a lot of kind of emotional things at play too. So somebody said, I'm glad I don't look sick, but it's frustrating because it's hard for others to understand how I can look so good when I say I feel so bad. Somebody said they feel like an outsider at food-focused events since they can't participate. And it's worse when others make a big deal about what I'm not eating or what I'm eating. A lot of people mentioned feeling like they were on display when they were eating, which makes them very uncomfortable. I become fearful of eating or doing something that might make me feel ill. Food is a constant source of anxiety. That's something that was repeated a lot, something you have to think about all the time. I feel like it's consumed my whole life. It can definitely feel all-consuming, especially in the beginning. Hopefully, as one implements their management plan, though, and especially in order to live well and for you to live well as a loved one, there comes a point where it opens up a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Stress makes my symptoms worse, but having the condition is very stressful. That is very true. I can tell you from personal standpoint. Many people said that they feel guilty about their new limitations, about their symptoms, about how they impact you, their loved ones, their spouses, their children, their friends, their partners, their parents. Many people said that they feel guilty, in terms of the financial burden, in terms of not being able to do things that they used to be able to do. This is a big one. And it's also a grieving process, right? Because if you have gastroparesis, you have to let go of your old normal and trial and error to find your new normal. Now, what I think a lot of people with gastroparesis might not think about is that for you as a loved one, it's kind of the same, right? Because you also to let go of the way things were right before gastroparesis and acknowledge that, at least for the time being, things are different. And there will be a new normal. And it's a trial and error for everybody. Everybody together, to kind of work together and find that new normal. So that's just a look at what it's like, in the words of people with gastroparesis, physically and mentally. You probably hear it from your loved one, but to hear it from other people, maybe you see some continuity, you see some differences, but you certainly see that they are not alone and you are not alone in being in this situation. So with all of that said, okay, that kind of sounds depressing, but what I want you to know is that it is possible for all of you to live well with gastroparesis, for you as a family, for you as a couple, for you as a friendship, okay, for you within your relationship, to live well with gastroparesis, for not just for the GPer, but for all of you, okay? And so this takes several things working all together. So this looks like the comprehensive management plan, but it's even a little bit bigger. It's even a little bit wider. This takes acceptance by both the person with gastroparesis and by you. Okay, everybody has to acknowledge that gastroparesis is present, that it's a part of your new reality. If you go to youtube.com/cceltrelli, you will find a video that I made last year specifically about acceptance and gastroparesis. And just as a side note, there's about 4 hours worth of video there, all free, and all about gastroparesis. So if you have more questions as a loved one, or if you want to help provide more resources to your loved one with gastroparesis, you can check that out if you haven't already. But acceptance is a really important part, because if we're kind of burying our heads in the sand and pretending everything is still the way it was, and trying to do everything the same way we did it before gastroparesis was in the picture, it's really not going to help anybody. That's going to be really stressful for everybody. And so it requires acceptance not just on the part of the person who has gastroparesis. So, they have to say, like, yes, right now I have gastroparesis. Maybe next year I won't, maybe, next month I won't, but right now I do. And I have to do what I can to best manage it and to live well despite it. But the other people in their life have to do the same. The other people in their life have to also accept that, things have changed. And that's a process. It's a process for everybody, but it's something to be cognizant of and keep working on. And this requires trial and error in all areas, okay? So just as your loved one with GP has to try different foods and different diets and different medications and, different lifestyle practices, and within their comprehensive management plan, there is, tons of trial and error. But in terms of your relationships as well, and in terms of how you support each other, and in terms of the ways that you devote resources to your priorities, within the context of managing gastroparesis, it's all going to be trial and error. And so it requires patience. It requires a lot of communication and a lot of honesty on both sides as to what's working and what's not working. What are you worried about? What can we do? How can we do this better? Obviously, the implementation of a comprehensive management plan, that's really important, because if if symptoms aren't well managed, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to live well with this condition, whether you're the person with the condition or you're the person who loves the person with the condition, because they're going to be physically miserable, and it's difficult to live well that way, and it's difficult to see your loved one that way. So that's an important piece of allowing all of you to live well. And that's something to recognize too. If they're devoting their time to their comprehensive management plan, if they're taking the time to be physically active, to do a relaxation practice, to make their meals specially, to learn how to make GP-friendly meals, it's not just helping them, and that's not selfish. It's really going to help all of you in the long run, as they can better manage their symptoms, as their quality of life improves. Everybody's quality of life will improve. Okay, it also requires a change in priorities, like I said, which is reflected by a change in action. And so you have to identify what are our new priorities. You know, if your priorities are for the person to be able to manage their symptoms as well as possible, that might require shifting around some of your household duties. It might require shifting around some of your finances. It might require shifting around some of your time. And again, trial and error, you know, these all interplay. And so that's necessary for them, okay? The person with gastroparesis, they have to identify their own priorities, and they have to really take the action in terms of implementing their comprehensive management plan. But it includes everyone around them. Various types of support are important, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how different forms of support, because, you know, not everyone needs the same kind of support, and not everyone can provide the same kind of support. And it comes in different forms. So maybe for some people, they need people not to talk to them about gastroparesis, okay, for the most part. They just want to talk about other stuff. Some people really need to vent. Some people need someone to bounce ideas off of. You know, some people need someone to help them implement different parts of their gastroparesis management plan. So support comes in various forms. We'll talk about that, you know, what that looks like in a minute more in depth. But the important thing is that they have various types of support from various friends and family members. This is something else I talk about in my self-guided program and in my book. You know, you can't just, as a person with gastroparesis, you can't rely on just one person for all of your support. And if you are that person, if you're in that kind of situation right now where someone with gastroparesis is really leaning on you for everything, for every kind of support, it's important to help them broaden that base. And sometimes this includes professional support, therapy. Again, it doesn't mean gastroparesis is in the head. I see a therapist every week, and it's been hugely beneficial for me. It's a difficult thing to deal with, mentally and physically. And from a mental perspective, it's not a bad idea for loved ones, you know. This is a big deal, and this is life-altering for everybody involved. So that's a little side note, but that can be helpful. And lastly, you know, once kind of all of this is in place, especially once there's a comprehensive management plan in place, once everyone's well educated and gets what's going on and knows what needs to be done, opening life up a little bit so that gastroparesis is not the only focus of every day, of every conversation, of everything, it can go a really long way towards improving life for everybody, okay? Because, you know, your loved one has not become gastroparesis. They are still them, the person that they were prior to diagnosis, but it's really, really easy and really, really common to get kind of sucked into that, where it's your whole world. And that, you know, it's not. Life is so much more than that. And so once there's a foundation that's been laid, you know, once you're kind of beyond that frantic diagnosis period, and you kind of know what needs to be done, and you're taking strides to get there, all of you as a, you know, as a family or as a couple, then to remember to focus on other things and make life about more than gastroparesis is an important part of allowing everybody to live well. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about before I take your questions, I want to give you some suggestions for how to best support somebody with gastroparesis. And like I said, not every person with gastroparesis is going to want to be supported in the same way. And not every person in general can offer the same kind of support. And your loved one may have a variety of needs. You know, in the self-guided program, I talk about, you know, building a support team, okay? And I have a worksheet to help people identify the various different kinds of support they need and think through who in my life could offer this kind of support to me, so that they're not relying all on one person and that they're identifying the best fit for the support. And I'll give you just a brief personal example. You know, I have had gastroparesis for 8 years, and I learned, along with my husband, about halfway through, you know, about 4 years ago, that it wasn't good for our relationship. It wasn't good for him. It wasn't good for me. For him to be the person that I vented to or really talked about the nitty-gritty details of gastroparesis and gastroparesis management with, because he was living it so closely with me every single day that to then, really go into the details and talk things through and say, well, maybe I should try this diet, and my symptoms are flaring up, but I can't figure out why, and, to really kind of go through the nitty-gritty, to have him be a sounding board for that. It wasn't a good fit because that kind of brought him down more. It just made our life more about gastroparesis. I was frustrated when I didn't get the response I wanted from him. And so we eventually figured out that, hey, that's not a great fit. My mom, on the other hand, is the perfect fit for that. She gladly will talk through options. She'll help me brainstorm, if I'm having a flare-up, and, she'll help me think, like, okay, what's different? Like, let's think through this. What have you done differently? What's stressful? What have you kind of let go of in your comprehensive management plan? So she's a good fit for that. My husband is a great fit for comforting me when I don't feel well physically. He'll make me some broth, and he'll rub my feet, and he'll make sure, I'm set up on the couch with my favorite TV program, and he'll keep me company. We'll play board games. He's fantastic for that. And that's where he fits, in my support team. And that was the best thing we could have done for our relationship, honestly, was figure that out. So not everybody is going to be the best fit for every kind of support. So I want you to keep that in mind, and hopefully your loved one with GP can keep that in mind, and they have a broad base from which to garner the different kinds of support. So it's really important for most people with gastroparesis to have somebody that can attend doctor's appointments with them. Doctor's appointments can be really overwhelming for the person with a chronic illness. Even, if you just have had, any kind of acute illness, that sometimes when you're not feeling well, you are either not really paying attention, or you're just overwhelmed, or sometimes you're scared. Sometimes, you're nervous to speak up for yourself, but you can speak up for others, so that's where loved ones can come into play as well, in terms of being their advocate in the doctor's office. Sometimes you just forget, right? You're so overwhelmed. You're listening to what the doctor says. You don't remember that you had these certain questions you wanted to ask. So attending doctor's appointments, being a second ear, being an advocate, really speaking up on behalf of your loved one can be really helpful. You can encourage self-care, and so by that I mean almost give permission. Let your loved one know it's okay. Like, I know this is part of your management plan. I know that you need to, devote time to being physically active, to relaxing, to sleeping. I know that you need to do that. It's okay, and I encourage you to do that. And then as the loved one, so you listening to me right now, you should practice it yourself, because it's going to make a big difference for everybody. This is stressful for everybody. Everybody needs to really focus on self-care and make that a priority, and then everyone will be more effective in the relationship. But definitely letting people know, especially if you're a husband, okay, letting your wife know that it's okay for her to prioritize self-care can go a very long way, because I know women especially tend to feel very guilty for doing that and feel selfish. And there's nothing selfish about it, because, like I said, it's an important part of GP management, and when symptoms are better managed, everybody benefits. Okay, you can be respectful of their new limitations and priorities. That means not forcing new foods, not forcing activities, not kind of pushing them past where they say they're comfortable going. Also, if they are devoting their time differently in order to manage GP, being cognizant of that. You can participate and encourage activities to help them manage the condition. I actually love this one because I think this can benefit both parties. So yoga, for instance, is a really great way to manage gastroparesis. So you can take yoga classes together, practice yoga at home. You can go for a walk. Walking is like the best thing for gastroparesis, so effective. Go for a walk after dinner, go for a walk in the morning. I mentioned relaxation practices. You can start learning to meditate, which sounds, kind of scary and like a big deal to a lot of people, but it's very simple. You can do those kinds of things together. Cooking is a great one, learning to cook gastroparesis-friendly meals and doing it together. Juicing, super, super healthy for everybody. It's not just for people with gastroparesis. That's something you can do together. GP-friendly activities, definitely. things that don't necessarily involve food, so we'll talk about that in a minute, but doing things that will help them to manage their symptoms, but then also allow you to be together. And they're all healthy things, so they'll all benefit you as well. Use and encourage supportive, proactive language. I'm a big stickler for the words that we use. This is, my personal thing. Not everybody resonates with it, but I think that the words that we use are powerful, and I think that the messages that we say and receive repetitively kind of form our view of things. And so, instead of saying, the thing that I often use with people with gastroparesis is to say, instead of saying you're suffering from gastroparesis, to say you've been diagnosed with gastroparesis, you're managing gastroparesis, those kinds of things. So subtle changes in language that can go a long way, but being proactive about it and encouraging positivity. And that doesn't mean ignoring the reality, okay? It just means using words that reflect where you want to go, where you want to be. And for a lot more on this, there's another free class that I did called Make a Choice to Make a Change, and I talk about this kind of thing a lot. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I won't go any further into it here, but you can check out that class at my website, livingwithgastroparesis.com. It's a great thing to watch with your GP. Okay, remember and remind them that they are more than gastroparesis. I mentioned a minute ago that we can get lost in the gastroparesis diagnosis. So remember that they're still your wife or husband or daughter or mother or friend or whomever. They're still Mary or Joe or Sarah, and they're much more than gastroparesis. And remind them that by doing things that you used to do. Okay, by encouraging them to do things that they used to do, things that don't involve gastroparesis, conversations that don't revolve around gastroparesis, plan non-food focused activities so that gastroparesis doesn't have to come up. When you're socializing, socialize over things that either where food isn't there, which doesn't usually happen in this country, but where food isn't the main focus at least, okay? So bowling or mini golfing or movies or something like that as opposed to going out to dinner. Or if you are going out to dinner, identifying a place and having a list of places where that they can go so that every time you're going somewhere, you don't just be like, well, where can we get you something that you can eat? Just kind of building that up as a family and as a couple and knowing what these non-food focused activities or GP-friendly activities are and selecting from those can be really helpful. Being flexible is really important because it's really hard to make plans when you have gastroparesis, and that can be frustrating both for the person with gastroparesis and for their loved ones. Now, if you have lived with somebody or been in a close relationship with somebody with gastroparesis for any length of time, you probably know this, but it's hard to predict how someone will feel on any given day or even from morning to night. So you have to be flexible and you have to have a plan B. So when you make plans, maybe say, okay, so this is our plan. If for some reason you don't feel good, what would you want to do instead? Would you want, if you have plans for other people, for example, say you made plans with your children or with another couple, no. Do they want you to go by yourself if they don't feel well? Or do they want to, have a different plan if they don't feel well? Do they want to scrap it all together and just hang out at home if they don't feel well? It's important to know that in advance and talk about that in advance and know that other people that you might be socializing with, to let them know in advance that you need to be flexible as well. But one thing you can do is really follow their lead, and by their lead I mean the GP's lead. And so some people with gastroparesis don't want to talk about it, and they don't want it to be the focus. Some people with gastroparesis want to feel like you acknowledge that they are dealing with this condition. So you kind of follow their lead. If you ask how they're doing and they say, I'm good, that's really it, they don't really want to talk about it, and that's okay. If you ask them and, they want to talk about it, then talk about it. So not everyone with gastroparesis feels the same way, and you kind of have to follow the person's lead and ask them what they need from you. Ask them, how can I best support you? Come right out and ask, because a lot of times people won't come out and tell you if you don't ask. But if you ask, they might say, well, what I really need is just for you to acknowledge I'm dealing with this. When I don't feel good, just be like, yeah, this is really, this is hard. When I do feel good, encourage me with my management plan. Keep me going. So have an honest conversation and be honest with them about how it affects you. Be honest with them about what they can do to make it easier for you. And I think having that communication both ways will make it easier for both people to, make the necessary adjustments and keep the honest lines of communication going. Lastly, help them obtain additional forms of support. So that's like we talked about before. If you really feel like you're the only form of support they have, help them broaden that. And whether that means other people in your life, other loved ones, other friends, or it means professional support, obtaining a therapist of some kind, a mental health practitioner, that can be really important and really beneficial. So those are some ideas. Some suggestions, but like I said, it's trial and error, and it's asking, and it's listening, and it's figuring out what works best for you as a couple or as a family, for your GP and for you personally. That's really what gastroparesis management comes down to in all aspects, is what works best for any given person, and you have to do some experimentation to find that out. But that's all I have prepared for you. Like I said, I went a little long. I apologize for that, but I always have a lot to share. So what I want to do now is take any questions that you might have that I did not answer, either about gastroparesis itself or, maybe ways that you can support somebody with gastroparesis. I want you to bear with me because the questions, the way that these questions pop up, they're kind of all in one window, and every time someone types, it goes back to the bottom of the window. So I have to scroll and try to read all of them. So bear with me, but I will answer as many as I can. If you have a question, go ahead and type it in now. And I am going to start answering these questions. All right, let's see. Somebody asked about gastroparesis and sugar levels. This is something I don't really specialize in diabetic gastroparesis. I don't have it personally, and I'm not really qualified as a health professional to give advice on diabetes. So that's not something that I really specialize in. But I can help you try to find resources for that. If you send me an email at info@crystalsaltrelli.com. Okay. I can't really, I'll answer all general questions. I can't necessarily answer really specific questions about like specific cases, only because we don't have a lot of time and I don't know everybody's background, but I'm reading through. Somebody asked about H. pylori, and I can't really give like a personal answer here, but H. pylori is a virus that can cause gastroparesis, and treating the H. pylori is necessary and often will help alleviate the symptoms or even eliminate the symptoms. Okay, someone said they're a mother of a 23-year-old son with GP. It's overwhelming. Yes, I can only imagine being pregnant, how overwhelming it would be to see your child go through this. What can I do in the ER when the nurses and doctors don't understand? That's a really difficult one, especially in the ER, because you're really, they're really wanting to kind of get you in and get you out, and you're not seeing people who know. There are resources that you can find online that you can print out and take with you to the ER, but you have to get people to actually read them and pay attention. This is a difficult one. Sometimes you really have to stand your ground. Sometimes you have to, unfortunately, seek multiple opinions. if one ER sends you home, you might have to go to another one if they really need fluids or they really need medication. I don't have a good answer to this, unfortunately. Travel and vacation. I actually have an article on my website about travel as well as a video. Those are both free, so you can go to livingwithgastroparesis.com and type in travel, and you should get those. How often should the 4-hour emptying study be repeated? Okay, two good questions here. The 4-hour emptying study is usually done to diagnose it. Sometimes it'll be done again to see if the gastroparesis has resolved, but really, in my opinion, the most accurate measure of whether or not the gastroparesis is resolved is how somebody feels, right? So that's really the bottom line. If you're not feeling any better, you probably don't need to do the emptying study again. Are there different degrees of gastroparesis as far as the diagnosis goes? Well, this is kind of a tricky question because there are certainly different degrees of delayed gastric emptying. Okay, so someone can have really severely delayed gastric emptying. Someone might have mildly delayed gastric emptying. But the delay in gastric emptying does not necessarily line up with the symptoms and the severity of symptoms. So there are people who have very delayed gastric emptying who have very few gastrointestinal symptoms. And on the flip side, usually that would be someone with diabetes, and the way they actually find out they have gastroparesis, or the way that they come to be evaluated for it is because they have difficulty managing their blood sugar, okay, not necessarily from GI symptoms. On the flip side, there are people who have minimally delayed gastric emptying or even normal gastric emptying who have very severe symptoms. And this is something that most motility docs know, but most general docs, don't really know. They think, if your stomach is only emptying a little bit slow, you shouldn't really have that bad of symptoms, and for whatever reason, that's not the way it goes. There are other things at play when it comes to gastroparesis other than just the emptying time. And so, yes, there are certainly various degrees of gastroparesis. It runs the gamut. Some people have very mild symptoms, some people have very severe symptoms, but that doesn't always line up with the results of the gastric emptying study. Okay, someone said every time my dad has attempted to have an emptying study, he's gotten very sick and ended up in the hospital for days. Any other suggestions or ideas? There is another test. It's called the SMART pill. And in this, you swallow a capsule that has all sorts of technology in it. And it measures emptying time throughout the entire GI tract, as well as things like pH levels, I believe temperature, all kinds of things. And so for people who can't eat the eggs, the SMART pill may be an option. It's not an option for everybody. It depends on other things like whether or not you have blockages or those kinds of things. But that might be something to look into for him. Okay, someone said his wife's GP is a symptom of a larger problem called autonomic neuropathy. Do I know how common this connection is and how it changes the treatment approach? So the autonomic nervous system controls digestion, heart rate, blood pressure, all sorts of things. And when there is a problem with the autonomic nervous system, usually GP is just one part of that. In terms of any underlying condition when it comes to gastroparesis, that has to be kind of the primary approach, right? Because you're not going to be able to get rid of the gastroparesis without managing the autonomic neuropathy. The connection is common, and it doesn't really change. It doesn't really change the management plan for gastroparesis. Okay, so in terms of the fact that your wife has gastroparesis as a result of the autonomic neuropathy, the gastroparesis symptoms themselves to be managed in the same way, okay, through that comprehensive management plan. But the autonomic neuropathy as a whole is something that would be, looked at in a broader context. I hope that makes sense. Let's see. How do you help GPers with pain management? Well, I really, I don't because that's really, when we're talking pain management, that's a medical thing, and so that's something you really have to talk with the doctor about. The problem with pain management when it comes to gastroparesis is that, A, there aren't a lot of good options, okay? There's just not a lot of good treatment options for pain. B, a lot of the treatment options actually exacerbate motility issues. So narcotic pain meds in particular slow the GI tract. So it's kind of, it's a catch-22 in a lot of ways, unfortunately. But pain management is something that can be very difficult. I mean, for people whose primary symptom of gastroparesis is pain, it's very difficult because it's probably one of the hardest symptoms to manage. If the pain is not terribly severe, heat is very, very helpful. Different kinds of complementary therapies are very helpful. Things like biofeedback and hypnotherapy have actually proven to be as helpful as medication in some cases for functional abdominal pain. Acupuncture. So a lot of times if you've been to the doctor, right, you've been through that route, if that's not working for you, looking into complementary therapies, especially for the hard to manage symptoms like pain, that's kind of your next step, okay? That would be my suggestion. And, it's difficult because a lot of people don't believe that pain is a symptom. But if you get to a good motility specialist, they will know that pain is a symptom. Like I said, though, it becomes a catch-22 with the medical management. So I might look into the complementary therapies, especially gut-directed hypnotherapy. If you can find a practitioner in your area, has been proven in studies to be very, very effective. Is GP related to other disorders? Yes, many other disorders, scleroderma, different kinds of neuropathies, like we said, a whole bunch of things is in terms of underlying conditions. MS, yes, I see that here. Parkinson's disease. So yes, gastroparesis can be a secondary result of those other primary conditions. Let's see. Do you have any tips on how to find a good gastrointestinal doctor or specialist? Well, this is a hard one because the specialists in this particular area, they're called motility specialists. They are few and far between. If you have one in your area or if you can get to one, that can be very helpful. For instance, I see a doctor now that's in New Hampshire. I live in Western New York, so that's a 7-hour trip both ways. Each way. I used to see doctors at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, so that was actually a 16-hour trip each way. It's the unfortunate reality that the motility specialists are few and far between. On my website at livingwithgastroparesis.com, if you type in the search box, finding a specialist, I did put together a list of doctors in a variety of states who may or may not be motility specialists that other people with gastroparesis have recommended, that they've seen. So that might be a good place to start. I do know of docs in a variety of cities, but not in every city that I can recommend. One thing you can do is go on Medtronic.com. They are the people who make the gastric neurostimulator, which is a treatment for severe symptoms of gastroparesis, nausea and vomiting in particular. And if you do a find a doctor search, you'll come up with surgeons who implant the gastric neurostimulator, but you could call that surgeon's office and ask which gastroenterologist refers patients to them for gastric neurostimulator surgery. And then that way you know that that doctor has experience with gastroparesis. That's one way to go about it. It's kind of backwards, but that's a suggestion that has worked for some other people. It can be difficult. Okay. I've seen a lot of contradictory information in terms of what is good and bad to eat, specific items. Let's see, specific items like bananas, grapes, etc. When it comes to deciding what to eat? Is it just trial and error? There are guidelines for sure. I actually wrote a book called Eating for Gastroparesis. It's an ebook as well as a paperback, but it's really kind of all about the basics of eating for gastroparesis and the guidelines of eating for gastroparesis. There's a ton of information about it on my website. Actually, if you go to youtube.com/csultrelli, there's a video free called, I think it's called the 10 Principles of Eating for Gastroparesis, and those are the guidelines. There are definitely guidelines that most people with gastroparesis should follow, but it does involve a lot of trial and error. Okay. A transcript of this session, yeah, I can do a written transcript. I can get that. It will be recorded, though. So if for anybody who couldn't listen, they will be able to download the recording and listen. Contact information for GP specialists in the military community in Europe. I only know of a handful of specialists in Europe. And in terms of the military community, though, this is a really interesting piece because the military is actually starting to look into functional GI disorders specifically. There's actually an act that passed in Congress last year or in the previous session that allows the Department of Defense to start researching functional gastrointestinal motility disorders because so many people in the military are now dealing with them. It's thought to be largely a result of the stress of being in the military combined with factors like viruses, poor food supply, that kind of thing. So kind of a combination of factors. Most cases of gastroparesis, in my opinion, are a combination of factors. But, you know, if you go to DHA.org, that's the Digestive Health Alliance, they have a great deal of information regarding the military component, and so they may have some better resources for you regarding the military community in Europe. So that's DHA.org. I would check that out. Okay, let me see. I think we've got one more question. IBS and gastroparesis, chicken or egg? Well, not everyone with IBS has GP. Not everyone with GP has IBS. In my opinion, it's probably somewhere along a scale. They're both functional GI disorders. You know, one is more intestinal, one is more stomach related, but I think the symptoms overlap. I think the diagnoses often overlap. It's a functional problem throughout the gut in most cases, presented in different ways. So, all right, I think that's it, guys. Oh, one more quick question. Oh, I will. Thank you very much. Someone said, good luck with your pregnancy. When is the baby expected? I am expecting September 20th. So thank you for asking, and thank you for the good wishes. Hopefully, I think those are all the questions. If I missed any, I apologize. But I think I got through all of them. So sorry that we went a little long, but I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope that it will be helpful in you know, your families and in your relationships. And if you do need more information, you can find a ton of information on my website, livingwithgastroparesis.com. Again, check out the YouTube videos, and hopefully that will help. So thanks for joining me, and I hope that you have a great night.